My name is Autumn Mitchell. I am 32 years old. A few months ago, I walked into my local bank to wire the closing funds for my dream home, only to discover my parents had drained my entire $128 life savings. They took every cent I had earned preserving historic buildings to fund my older brother's logistics software startup. I did not scream. I did not beg. I went straight to my former boss. She poured 2 glasses of neat bourbon, listened quietly, picked up her phone, and made a single phone call to a venture capital auditor. By the time the sun came up the next day, the curated, wealthy facade of my family was about to collapse. Before I take you back to that humid July morning, take a second to like and subscribe to Pana Vengeance. Drop a comment telling me your age, where you are watching from, and what time it is right now. It was a Tuesday in Alexandria, the kind of midsummer morning where the Virginia humidity settles on your skin the second you step outside. I felt invincible. I was a historic preservationist. My career meant crawling through dusty county archives, saving 18th century masonry, and writing endless restoration grants. I spent the last decade living in a cramped apartment, eating cheap meals, and working late into the night just to watch my savings account grow. I was finally closing on my own place. It was a dilapidated but beautiful brick row house near the waterfront, a piece of history with good bones waiting to be restored. It was my slice of hard-earned independence. I walked into the bank branch on King Street. The chilled air conditioning raised goosebumps on my arms. The lobby smelled of floor wax and fresh ink. I walked straight up to the counter and greeted Mrs. Gable. She was a teller I had known since my high school days. I slid the wire transfer form across the cool marble counter. My fingers were trembling a little, but it was from pure anticipation. I told her I was finally getting the keys to the row house. Mrs. Gable smiled warmly and congratulated me. She picked up the slip, adjusted her reading glasses, and began typing on her keyboard. I watched her hands move. I listened to the clack of the keys. Then the typing stopped. Her smile vanished. She leaned closer to the monitor, her brow furrowed. She hit the refresh key. The silence stretched between us. The hum of the air conditioner suddenly sounded deafening in my ears. Mrs. Gable looked up at me. Her face had lost its color. She lowered her voice to a fragile whisper. She told me my father was here. She said Richard Mitchell came in right when the doors opened at 9 this morning. She swallowed hard and told me the account was nearly empty. I stared at her. The words did not form a logical sentence in my mind. I asked her to run the routing number again. I told her I had $128,000 in that account. Mrs. Gable turned the monitor slightly so I could see the glowing green digits. The balance read $16.40. She explained it to me slowly. It was a custodial setup from my childhood. When I turned 18, my father, a senior wealth manager in Loudoun County, advised me to keep the joint account structure until I turned 35. He told me it was a sophisticated tax shield. I trusted him to guard my future, but the law saw the money as his just as much as mine. He simply walked in, signed his name, and walked out with a decade of my life in a cashier's check. My chest tightened. The freezing air in the bank felt like a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. Mrs. Gable reached across the counter to offer a glass of water. Her voice sounded warped. I pulled my hand back, grabbed my purse, and pushed through the heavy glass doors into the glaring Virginia heat. The subtropical air wrapped around my throat. Tourists in pastel clothes blurred into meaningless streaks of color. My stomach rolled. I managed 5 steps down the brick sidewalk before my knees buckled. I grabbed the edge of a wrought iron decorative planter to catch myself. I leaned over the dark metal and threw up my morning coffee into the damp soil. People stepped around me, casting concerned glances, but I only saw that glowing screen. $16. 10 years of restoring rotting foundations, 10 years of denying myself vacations, evaporated in a single morning. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand. A memory surfaced with sickening clarity. I was 16 years old, handing my father my very first paycheck. He folded it into his leather wallet, smiling and promising to keep it safe so we could build my foundation. He planned this. I stood up on shaking legs. I walked to my car, got inside, and gripped the steering wheel. I did not shed a single tear. Grief is a luxury for people who still have a safety net. I put the car in gear and pointed the tires west toward Loudoun County. I needed an answer. The drive west on Route 7 felt like navigating through a suffocating tunnel. The tires of my sedan hummed a frantic rhythm against the asphalt, vibrating up through the steering wheel and into my bones. The Virginia summer sun beat down on the windshield, turning the interior of my car into an oven. But a cold shiver ran down my spine. My mind raced, searching for any rational explanation, any clerical error that could explain the missing funds. But deep down, I knew the truth. The pieces of a bizarre puzzle had been scattered around my father for weeks, waiting for me to connect them. Richard Mitchell was a man who prized control. As a senior wealth manager, he operated with a calm, polished efficiency. But his behavior had shifted late in the spring. I remembered sitting in their kitchen last month, watching him stalk the mail carrier through the front window with feverish intensity. He would intercept the letters before my mother or the housekeeper could even open the silver mailbox at the end of the driveway. He pocketed thick, unmarked envelopes with a tight jaw. During family dinners, he frequently excused himself, stepping out onto the crushed gravel to take hushed, tense phone calls. I had watched him pace the perimeter of the lawn, kicking at the stones, his voice dropping to an anxious whisper. At the time, I assumed a client was going through a volatile divorce or a nasty corporate merger. I never imagined the crisis was his own, and I certainly never imagined my savings account would become the collateral damage. The suburban sprawl of strip malls and traffic lights slowly gave way to the rolling green hills of Loudoun County. I turned onto my parents' street. The sprawling colonial estate sat safely tucked behind tall wrought iron gates. It was a picture-perfect monument to curated Virginia wealth. Manicured hedges lined the long driveway. 2 massive oak trees framed the pristine white columns of the front porch. The house projected an aura of unshakable stability and generational success. It looked like the kind of place where nothing bad ever happens, where the money never runs out, and where parents protect their children. I threw the car into park near the fountain. I did not bother turning off the engine. I shoved the door open and marched up the brick steps. My shoes slammed against the porch. My parents were sitting on the shaded veranda enjoying the late morning breeze. A crystal pitcher of iced tea rested on a glass table between them, condensation dripping down the sides. My father wore a crisp polo shirt reading a financial newspaper. My mother, Helen, sat across from him in a light linen sundress, thumbing through a home decor magazine. They looked so painfully normal. They looked tranquil. The juxtaposition between their relaxed morning and the total devastation of my life made my vision blur. I did not deliver a calm, measured greeting. I demanded to know where my money went. My voice cracked on the first syllable, tearing out of my throat in a raw, ragged demand. I stood there, waving the bank receipt, asking what he did with $128,000. My father did not jump out of his chair. He did not look surprised. He slowly lowered his newspaper and folded it on the table. He smoothed the wrinkles on his shirt. He looked at me, not with the shame of a thief, but with the mild irritation of a man interrupted during his morning coffee. He crossed his arms over his chest and told me to lower my voice because the neighbors might hear. I shrieked that I did not care about the neighbors. I told him he robbed me. Richard leaned back in his wicker chair. He maintained a patronizing level tone. He admitted taking the funds. He did not deny the withdrawal, but he refused to call it theft. He looked me dead in the eye and called it a family tax. He stated that the money was transferred to my older brother, Chase. Chase was launching a new logistics software startup. He needed immediate liquid capital to secure an expensive commercial lease in a trendy tech corridor near the Capitol. The venture capital firms were moving too slowly, and the banks required too much interest. My father decided my life savings would serve as the perfect seed round. I felt the wooden planks of the veranda spin beneath my feet. I asked him how he could steal my future, to pay for my brother to play tech entrepreneur. I told him I was closing on a house in 3 days. My father stiffened. His jaw tightened into a rigid line. He pointed a finger at me, his voice adopting a chilling, pragmatic logic. He told me I was looking at the situation selfishly. He said I was a single woman with a steady job at the Historical Society. I had no dependents. I had no immediate need for real estate. He claimed my brother was trying to build a legacy, a tech empire that would generate real wealth for the entire Mitchell family. Richard looked at me with cold calculation and said, the family needed to launch this company, and I was being greedy for hoarding cash while my brother was trying to secure the family name. The casual misogyny underlying his financial calculation stole the breath from my lungs. My father did not view me as an autonomous adult. He viewed my career, my long hours, and my discipline as nothing more than a temporary holding account. I was a financial reservoir waiting to be drained the moment his male heir required funding. I opened my mouth to argue, but my mother closed her magazine. Helen placed it on her lap and folded her hands together. She used the soft, condescending tone she reserved for misbehaving children. She told me to stop being so dramatic. She claimed nobody robbed me. We simply reallocated family resources. I stared at her through my tears. The phrase made no sense. I told her I earned that money, writing grant proposals late into the night. It was my house fund. It was my independence. Helen stood up and walked to the porch railing. She looked down at me with a chilling sense of entitlement. She asked me who paid for my braces when I was 12. She asked me who covered my undergraduate tuition so I would not graduate with student loans. She weaponized every act of basic parental care, turning my childhood into an itemized invoice. She told me I owed this family my support. She expected me to nod, smile, and walk away feeling grateful for the opportunity to fund my brother's dreams. The gaslighting was thick and suffocating. They were rewriting reality right in front of my eyes, framing my hard-earned independence as an unpaid debt. I am a historic preservationist. I spend my life analyzing antique architecture. I know how to look at a dilapidated 18th century building and spot the good bones beneath the peeling paint. I know what can be saved, what can be restored, and what is too far gone. Standing on that beautiful, expensive veranda, I looked at the two people who raised me. I saw the truth. My family was a rotting structure. There was no integrity left behind the white columns and the wrought iron gates. The foundation was built on toxic entitlement, and there were no good bones left to save. I could not find the breath to argue anymore. My throat felt lined with broken glass. I turned around and stumbled down the brick steps. I tripped on the bottom stair, nearly falling onto the driveway, but caught myself on the fender of my car. I heard my mother call my name, telling me to come back inside and calm down. I ignored her. I yanked the car door open, threw myself into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut. I locked it, put the car in reverse, and spun the tires on the manicured gravel. I sped out through the gates, leaving the colonial estate behind. I drove blind. Hot tears finally spilled over my eyelashes, burning my cheeks. My savings were gone. My historic row house was gone. The parents I thought I knew were strangers. I was entirely alone, plummeting toward an abyss. Then a sudden vibration rattled against the plastic cup holder. The screen of my phone lit up, casting a harsh glare in the dim interior of the car. I wiped my eyes and looked down. The caller identification displayed a single name: Chase. My golden child brother was calling. He wanted to talk. The screen of my phone cast a harsh blue light across the shaded interior of my sedan. The name flashing on the display belonged to my older brother. I stared at the caller identification, feeling a toxic mixture of dread and residual childhood loyalty churning in my stomach. Chase was 35 years old, a man who possessed a remarkable talent for failing upward. He carried the residual swagger of a high school athlete into adulthood, perpetually chasing the next lucrative shortcut. He had bounced from a collapsed craft brewery in Richmond to a defunct cryptocurrency consulting firm in Arlington, always landing safely on his feet because our parents constantly provided a hidden financial mattress. I picked up the device. My thumb hovered over the red decline button, but a desperate, fractured sliver of hope forced me to accept the call. I wanted him to sound frantic. I wanted him to confess that he had no idea our father raided my accounts. I needed to hear a frantic apology. I lifted the phone to my ear. Chase did not apologize. He greeted me with a breezy, upbeat cadence, sounding as though he were calling to share excellent news about a recent vacation. I could hear the faint hiss of an espresso machine and the low hum of chatter in the background. He was sitting in some sleek co-working space in the Dulles Tech corridor, drinking an overpriced latte, while my entire life burned to the ground. He skipped past any conventional pleasantries and launched directly into a polished pitch. He spoke with the rapid, confident rhythm of a Silicon Valley founder addressing a room full of naive investors. He did not use the word theft. He did not acknowledge that our father forged a signature. Instead, he framed the missing $128,000 as a temporary bridge loan. He casually tossed around industry jargon, talking about monthly burn rates, seed round valuations, and leveraging capital to scale operations. He spoke as if I were a venture capitalist who had willingly signed a term sheet, rather than a sister who had just thrown up in a planter box because her life savings evaporated. I sat in the sweltering car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned stark white. I tried to interrupt to inject the reality of the situation into his monologue, but he talked over me. Then he introduced a proposition that momentarily scrambled my understanding of the crime. He lowered his voice, adopting a conspiratorial, magnanimous tone. He offered me a 5% equity stake in his new logistics software startup. He called it a ground floor opportunity. He promised to draft a contract on a napkin if it made me feel better. He painted a vivid picture of a future buyout, insisting that my 5% would eventually yield millions when the company went public. I stopped trying to interrupt. I just listened to the steady, arrogant hum of his voice. A sudden, disorienting wave of confusion washed over me. The sheer delusion required to offer a stolen victim a pathetic equity stake was staggering. It served as a bizarre red herring. For a fleeting second, I wondered if this was not a malicious, calculated fraud, but rather an act of profound, arrogant stupidity. Did Chase genuinely believe he was doing me a favor? Was he so insulated by decades of our parents' coddling that he thought draining a municipal worker's bank account was standard venture capital strategy? The terrifying reality was that he did not see himself as a thief. He viewed himself as a visionary savior, rescuing my stagnant money to build his empire. I found my breath. I pushed past the hollow equity offer and forced the conversation back to the unforgiving present. I told him, my voice shaking with suppressed panic, that the closing date for my historic row house was exactly 3 days away. 72 hours. I explained that the title company required the wired funds by Friday afternoon, or the seller would terminate the contract. I told him I needed the cash returned immediately to save the earnest money I had already put down in escrow. Chase exhaled a long, heavy breath into the receiver. It was the distinct put-out sigh of a genius burdened by a small-minded subordinate. He did not register the panic in my voice. He told me I was suffering from a lack of vision. He called my dream of restoring an 18th century brick row house small thinking. He said I was too focused on mortar and old wood when I should be looking at macroeconomic growth. He instructed me to let the house go, dismissing a decade of my grueling archival work as a trivial hobby. He insisted that renting an apartment for another year was a minor inconvenience compared to the massive market disruption his logistics software would achieve. I opened my mouth to shout, but he deployed his ultimate psychological weapon before I could form a single word. Chase shifted his tone, dropping the corporate jargon to adopt the soft, protective cadence of an older brother. He reached back into our shared history and pulled out a memory we had not spoken about in 2 decades. He reminded me of a humid August afternoon when we were children, playing near the edge of our neighborhood. A stray dog had slipped its leash, charging aggressively toward me. Chase had stepped directly into the path of the animal, taking a deep, painful bite to his calf, so I could scramble over a chain-link fence to safety. He painted the picture vividly, weaponizing the nostalgia to manipulate my current despair. He reminded me of the scar he still carried on his leg. He said he protected me when it mattered most. He told me he took the hit for me then, and now it was my turn to absorb a temporary blow for him. He demanded I trust his leadership, expecting me to happily play the quiet martyr for his grand success. He did not wait for my response. He told me he had a meeting with an angel investor in 5 minutes, promised to send over the equity paperwork by the end of the week, and ended the call. The dial tone buzzed in the quiet cabin of my sedan. I lowered the phone to my lap. The illusion of my family shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Chase was not a malicious villain twirling his mustache. He was something far more dangerous. He was a man completely devoid of empathy, operating under the terrifying conviction that my survival was secondary to his ambition. I sat in the silence of the gravel shoulder, staring at the dense Virginia tree line. The emotional betrayal had gutted me, but as the shock began to recede, the concrete, terrifying mechanics of my physical reality snapped into focus. The row house was gone. There was no magical wire transfer coming to save the Friday closing, but the crisis extended far beyond losing my dream property. I picked up my phone and opened the banking application one more time, staring at the $16.40. My current landlord had already listed my apartment. I had submitted my formal notice to vacate 30 days ago, operating under the ironclad assumption that I would be moving into my newly purchased home this weekend. The management company had already signed a new tenant. I had no savings to offer a new security deposit. I had no cash to hire a moving truck. I did not even have enough money in my checking account to fill the gas tank of my car. The conflict shifted from a theoretical debate about family loyalty to a frantic ticking clock of physical survival. The ground beneath my feet was crumbling, and the crushing weight of imminent eviction was mere days away. The relentless math of poverty does not announce itself with a dramatic crash. It creeps in through quiet, suffocating calculations. I woke up the next morning on the faded fabric of my living room sofa. A stiff ache radiated down my neck. I stared up at a faint, yellowish water stain spreading across the apartment ceiling. It was shaped roughly like a map of a country I could no longer afford to visit. I reached for my phone on the coffee table. The screen illuminated the dim room, displaying a new email from my real estate agent. I opened the message. The language was cold, formal, and devoid of any human empathy. The seller had officially recognized my failure to wire the closing funds. I was in breach of contract. The property was immediately being relisted on the open market. The $10,000 earnest money deposit I had placed in escrow was legally forfeited. I dropped the phone onto my chest. That $10,000 was not just a line item on a spreadsheet. It was the physical manifestation of 3 grueling semesters tutoring undergraduate history students on weekends. It was 2 years of skipping dinners with friends, brewing my own coffee, and repairing cheap shoes instead of buying new ones. That grueling discipline had been erased by a few keystrokes in a legal document. A sharp, authoritative knock at my front door pulled me from the sofa. I walked across the scuffed hardwood floor and looked through the peephole. My property manager, a rigid man who treated tenant relations like a military operation, stood in the hallway holding a clipboard. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open just a few inches. He did not offer a greeting. He handed me a folded white envelope, stated that my move-out inspection was scheduled for the end of the month, and turned on his heel. I closed the door and tore the envelope open. It was a formal 14-day notice to vacate. The timeline was a brutal, unavoidable trap. When my offer on the historic row house was accepted weeks ago, I submitted my mandatory 30-day notice to end my current lease. The management company acted swiftly, securing a new tenant who was scheduled to move in on the first of the month. They had already collected the new deposit. There was no grace period. There was no month-to-month extension available. I had exactly 2 weeks to hand over the keys and empty the unit. I walked into my small kitchen and leaned against the laminate counter. I opened my banking application again, hoping some miraculous processing error had reversed the theft. The green numbers remained unchanged. $16.40. I began running the numbers in my head. Securing a new apartment in the Alexandria area required first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit. That meant I needed at least $4,000 in liquid cash just to sign a lease. I needed another $500 to hire a moving truck. I needed utility connection fees. The disparity between what my survival required and what I actually possessed was an insurmountable chasm. I could not even afford to buy cardboard boxes. I took a cold shower, put on a freshly pressed navy blazer, and drove to the Historical Society. Maintaining my professional facade required a monumental exertion of willpower. The Alexandria Municipal Archives were housed in a beautiful, climate-controlled brick building near the river. I spent my days surrounded by original 18th century land grants, architectural blueprints, and preservation mandates. My job was to protect the structural integrity of the city. I sat at my desk staring at a digitized map of a colonial estate. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A profound, hollow exhaustion settled deep into my bones. The stress of the last 48 hours had stripped my appetite, but by noon, a sharp, gnawing hunger began to claw at my stomach. I had skipped breakfast because the milk in my refrigerator had spoiled, and I could not justify spending $4 on a coffee shop pastry. A colleague walked past my cubicle carrying a microwave-safe bowl. The rich, heavy scent of roasted garlic and heated tomato soup drifted into my workspace. My stomach cramped violently. A sudden wave of dizziness washed over me, blurring the edges of my computer monitor. I gripped the edge of my desk, digging my fingernails into the wood to ground myself. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the room to stop spinning. My tailored blazer, bought 2 years ago for a preservation gala, hung loose on my shoulders, hiding the physical toll the panic was already taking on my body. I was a respected municipal professional, overseeing million-dollar restoration grants, and I was quietly starving at my own desk. When the clock finally struck 5, I did not drive back to my apartment. I drove behind a large supermarket on the edge of town, parking near the loading docks. The asphalt was sticky and smelled of rotting produce and hot diesel fuel. I waited until the delivery workers went inside before stepping out of my sedan. I walked over to a towering stack of discarded cardboard boxes near the industrial dumpsters. The humiliation was a physical weight. I was a woman with a master's degree, a woman who possessed excellent credit just 3 days ago, digging through trash for packing supplies. I pulled out several heavy-duty banana boxes, shaking off the loose debris and flattening them to fit into my trunk. I scavenged a dozen sturdy containers, loaded them into my car, and drove home. I spent the evening sitting on the floor of my living room, taping the scavenged boxes together. My apartment was filled with an extensive, heavy library of architectural history. I packed thick leather-bound volumes detailing Palladian-design colonial brickwork and early American timber framing. Each book I placed into a box felt like a mocking reminder of my reality. I dedicated my entire existence to saving historic structures, ensuring that ancient buildings stood the test of time. Yet my own foundation had been demolished in a single morning. I was meticulously packing the history of other people's homes while preparing to be thrown out of my own. I sealed the final box with a strip of clear tape and slumped back against the sofa. The room was dark, illuminated only by the amber glow of the streetlights filtering through the window blinds. I was surviving hour by hour, constructing a fragile mental dam to hold back the terrifying reality of my homelessness. Then, the screen of my phone lit up on the floor beside me. It was a text message from an old college roommate who still ran in the same affluent Loudoun County social circles as my parents. I opened the message. She did not ask how my row house closing went. She did not ask about my preservation work. She sent a cautious, overly delicate paragraph stating that she was worried about my health. She mentioned that she had spoken to my mother earlier that afternoon. My heart began to race, pumping a fresh surge of adrenaline through my exhausted veins. I stared at the text. My mother had told her that I was suffering from a severe emotional breakdown. Helen had spun a narrative claiming that I was experiencing irrational, bitter jealousy over Chase securing funding for his new software startup. My mother told the woman that I was isolating myself, acting erratically, and refusing to celebrate my brother's success. The phone trembled in my palm. The Mitchell family propaganda machine was operating with terrifying speed. My parents were not just content with stealing my life savings to cover their golden child. They recognized the danger I posed to their curated reputation. They knew that if I told the truth about the forged bank account, their high society facade would shatter. They had decided to strike first. By painting me as a hysterical, jealous spinster suffering a mental crisis, they were actively destroying my credibility. They were building a psychological fortress around their theft, ensuring that if I ever tried to scream for help, the entire community would simply shake their heads, pity my poor parents, and dismiss my truth as the ravings of an unstable woman. The threat was no longer just financial. The war had escalated, and I was losing ground faster than I could comprehend. The obligation to attend the retirement dinner was a tactical necessity. Skipping the event would only serve to validate the text message I had received the night before. If I hid in my apartment, I would confirm my mother's manufactured narrative that I was isolating myself and unraveling under the pressure of my own jealousy. I had to show my face. I had to prove I was stable, professional, and entirely rational. The gathering was hosted in the grand ballroom of a boutique hotel in downtown Alexandria, honoring the outgoing director of urban planning. The room was a sprawling expanse of crystal chandeliers, mirrored walls, and velvet drapery. It was packed with municipal officials, wealthy real estate developers, and local politicians. This was the exact intersection where my professional world collided with my parents' affluent social circle. I wore a tailored emerald silk dress I had purchased years ago. It hung loosely on my frame, betraying the weight I had lost in just a few days, but I cinched the belt tight and kept my posture rigid. I carried a plastic cup of sparkling water with a twist of lime, holding it near my chest to simulate a cocktail. The air was thick with the scent of roasted tenderloin, expensive perfume, and the sharp bite of gin. My stomach cramped, a dull, hollow ache radiating through my ribs. I had not eaten a substantial meal in 48 hours. I navigated the edge of the room, smiling at colleagues offering polite, practiced congratulations to the retiring director, and desperately trying to remain invisible. I stepped toward the back of the ballroom, seeking a brief reprieve near the catering tables. I just needed to survive another 30 minutes before I could reasonably make my exit. Before I could set my plastic cup down, a woman stepped directly into my path. She was a prominent Loudoun County socialite who sat on the Municipal Arts Board, a woman who treated local gossip as a competitive sport. She had known my parents for decades and frequently played tennis with my mother. She wore an ostentatious string of pearls and held a champagne flute. She did not offer a standard greeting. She reached out, placing a manicured hand on my forearm. Her grip was tight, pinning me in place. Her eyes scanned my face with unapologetic scrutiny, searching for the cracks in my armor. She tilted her head, adopting a hushed, suffocating tone of unsolicited pity. She told me she had spoken with Helen that morning. The socialite lowered her voice, treating her words like a delicate secret. She said my mother was sick with worry over my erratic behavior. She sighed a soft, theatrical sound and told me it was a tragedy that I had backed out of purchasing the historic row house at the last minute. I froze. My vocal cords seized. The woman continued delivering the rest of my mother's calculated lies with devastating efficiency. Helen had told the entire country club circuit that I suffered a severe mental break under the stress of the impending real estate transaction. According to my mother, I had grown paranoid, hoarding my savings and refusing to speak to my family. But the most insidious lie centered around my brother. The socialite offered a patronizing smile, telling me I needed to let go of my petty childhood rivalries. She said it was unfair of me to throw a temper tantrum just because Chase had finally secured seed funding for his brilliant logistics startup. She gently patted my arm, suggesting I seek professional psychiatric help so I could eventually learn to celebrate my brother's success. The sheer audacity of the gaslighting paralyzed me. I stood on the patterned carpets staring at the woman. My parents had not merely stolen my money. They had engineered a preemptive public relations strike. Helen was a master of the Loudoun County charity circuit. She understood that whoever tells the story first controls the truth. By framing my frugality as unhealthy hoarding and my stolen savings as a voluntary paranoid withdrawal from the real estate market, she insulated Richard from any suspicion. They painted me as a fragile, hysterical spinster to discredit any claims I might make about the forged bank account. I wanted to scream. I wanted to hurl my glass of water against the mirrored wall. I wanted to grab the socialite by her pearls and explain that my father was a thief who raided a custodial account to subsidize a fraud. But I looked around the glittering ballroom, the overlapping conversations, the clinking silverware, the watchful eyes of my municipal colleagues. The trap my mother set was flawless. If I raised my voice, I would look hysterical. If I burst into tears and accused a respected wealth manager of stealing my life savings to fund a Silicon Valley app, I would sound deeply paranoid. Every single reaction of righteous anger would perfectly validate the exact narrative my mother had planted. The people in this room preferred the comforting myth of the heroic, successful family dealing with a tragic, unstable daughter. They would never believe that a wealthy Loudoun County patriarch walked into a bank and robbed his own child. My heart began to race against my ribs. The upbeat jazz music playing from the corner of the ballroom warped into a chaotic, dizzying noise echoing in my ears. The smell of the catered tenderloin turned my stomach, causing bile to rise in my throat. I tried to form a coherent sentence. I stammered, managing only to utter a fragmented, weak denial. My voice sounded thin, breathless, and entirely unconvincing. The socialite offered one final, pitying look, telling me to take care of my mental health before releasing my arm and drifting back into the crowd. The air in the ballroom grew thin. My chest squeezed tight as if an iron band had been wrapped around my ribs. I could not pull enough oxygen into my lungs. The faces of my colleagues began to blur together into a terrifying, judgmental mosaic. A silent panic attack crashed over me. The professional reputation I had spent 8 years building, the career that allowed me to evaluate and grant municipal funding for historic sites, was evaporating in real time. If the city planning board believed I was mentally unfit, I would lose my job. I did not deliver a vindicating speech. I turned on my heel and walked briskly toward the rear exit. I left my favorite cashmere coat draped over a velvet chair. I pushed through the heavy service doors, bypassing the valet stand, and stumbled out into the humid, dark alley behind the hotel. I practically ran across the damp asphalt toward the parking garage. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I unlocked my sedan, threw myself into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. I pressed my sweaty forehead against the cool plastic of the steering wheel, gasping for air in the dim light of the parking structure. I was entirely cornered. I had no money to hire a lawyer. I had no home to retreat to. And now my community and my professional network were poisoned against me. The isolation was profound and terrifying. Family loyalty was the weapon they used to extract my compliance, and societal decorum was the weapon they used to silence my grief. As my breathing slowly returned to a normal rhythm, a singular, sharp thought pierced through the fog of my panic. I could not fight this war using emotional appeals. Pleading for justice from family friends who cared only about preserving the social order was a fatal mistake. To dismantle a lie built on high society whispers, I needed an ally who operated strictly on facts. I needed someone who despised the illusion of inherited wealth, someone who recognized a bad investment from a mile away, and someone who possessed the power to unearth a paper trail. I needed a predator. I lifted my head from the steering wheel. I knew exactly one person in the state of Virginia who fit that description. She did not care about the Mitchell family name. She did not care about country club gossip. She cared only about ledgers contracts and cold, hard data. I reached forward and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. I put the car in drive, exiting the parking garage, and pointed my tires toward the modernist glass estate of the only woman who could help me level the playing field. I steered my sedan away from the crowded downtown district, taking the winding roads that traced the Potomac River. The transition from the historic colonial architecture of Alexandria to the secluded, heavily wooded hills felt like crossing into a different dimension. I was driving toward the residence of Sylvia Sterling. Sylvia was my former boss, a woman who had mentored me during my early 20s when I briefly worked in commercial property appraisal before shifting to municipal preservation. Sylvia was a self-made commercial real estate mogul in her late 50s. She had built a staggering empire of office parks and retail centers by operating with a cold, unforgiving precision. She despised incompetence, detested emotional manipulation, and once famously fired her own nephew for padding a corporate expense account. She did not value social pedigree. She valued audited ledgers and ironclad contracts. Her home reflected her unyielding worldview. It was a stark, modernist fortress of poured concrete, steel beams, and floor-to-ceiling glass windows. It sat perched on a high ridge, hidden behind a dense line of mature pine trees. The architecture was deliberately transparent. There were no dark oak-paneled studies or heavy velvet curtains to hide behind. The house demanded pure illumination. I parked my car on the circular concrete pad and walked up to the towering glass front door. My emerald silk dress clung to my shivering frame. Despite the sweltering Virginia humidity, my teeth were chattering. The psychological toll of the hotel encounter had drained my core temperature, leaving me feeling hollow and brittle. I pressed the illuminated doorbell. A moment later, the heavy door swung open. Sylvia stood in the foyer. She wore a tailored charcoal jumpsuit, her silver hair pulled back into a severe, elegant knot. Her sharp gray eyes scanned my face, dropping down to my trembling hands and finally taking in the overall ruin of my posture. She did not gasp in shock. She did not offer a tight, patronizing hug or a whispered platitude. She recognized a casualty of war when she saw one. She simply stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter the wide, echoing hallway. Sylvia guided me into her sprawling living room. The space was pristine, furnished with low-profile leather sofas and polished chrome tables. The city lights twinkled in the distance through the glass walls. She walked over to a minimalist bar cart, picked up a heavy crystal decanter, and poured 2 generous measures of neat bourbon into thick glass tumblers. She handed one to me and pointed toward a white leather armchair. I sat down. My hands shook so badly the amber liquid sloshed against the rim of the crystal. I brought the glass to my lips and took a swallow. The bourbon burned a hot, trailing path down my throat, settling in my empty stomach and radiating a desperately needed warmth into my chest. Sylvia sat across from me on the sofa, resting her forearms on her knees. She looked at me with an unwavering, analytical gaze. She instructed me to start from the beginning, demanding dates, times, and exact monetary figures. I did not cry. The tears had burned themselves out on the gravel shoulder in Loudoun County 2 days ago. I delivered a clinical autopsy of my own ruin. I told her about the custodial trust account structure my father had mandated. I gave her the exact figure of $128,000. I recounted the Friday afternoon phone call with my brother, detailing his polished Silicon Valley jargon and the insulting offer of a 5% equity stake in his logistics software venture. I laid out the devastating math of my current reality. I explained the 14-day eviction notice sitting on my kitchen counter, the forfeited earnest money on the historic row house, and the cardboard boxes I had scavenged from a grocery store alley. Finally, I described the encounter at the retirement dinner just an hour prior. I explained how my mother had weaponized her country club network, launching a preemptive public relations strike to frame me as a paranoid, jealous spinster suffering a mental breakdown. Sylvia listened with terrifying stillness. She did not interrupt to offer sympathy. She absorbed the data, processing the timeline and the financial maneuvers with the speed of a high-frequency trading algorithm. When I finally finished speaking, the silence in the cavernous living room felt heavy. I took another sip of the bourbon, bracing myself for her assessment. I expected her to outline a long, grueling civil litigation strategy. I expected her to tell me that tracing the funds would take years. Instead, Sylvia set her crystal tumbler down on the chrome coffee table. The heavy glass hit the metal with a sharp, definitive clack that echoed off the concrete walls. She leaned back against the leather cushions and let out a low, humorless exhale. She looked at me, her gray eyes narrowing with a dangerous, calculated focus. She told me I was missing the actual plot. She stated that my parents did not steal my life savings to fund a visionary tech startup. Silvia revealed a piece of information that stopped the breath in my lungs. She told me that 3 weeks ago, a representative from a notorious distressed debt brokerage requested a private meeting in her corporate boardroom. This specific brokerage specialized in mezzanine debt. Mezzanine loans are predatory financial instruments of last resort. They carry exorbitant interest rates and are typically only utilized by commercial developers who have exhausted all traditional banking options and are teetering on the edge of total default. The broker had come to Silvia seeking to offload a portfolio of highly toxic commercial mortgages. The underlying collateral for those toxic loans consisted of several failing strip malls and vacant office parks located in the Dulles corridor. Silvia held my gaze and delivered the fatal truth. The signature on those defaulting commercial properties belonged to my father, Richard Mitchell. The room seemed to tilt. The polished concrete floor felt unsteady beneath my feet. I stared at my former boss, trying to process the sheer magnitude of the revelation. Silvia explained the mechanics of the illusion. My father was bleeding cash. His wealth management firm was a hollow shell, and his private commercial investments had cratered. He was drowning in millions of dollars of hidden, toxic debt. The sprawling colonial estate, the imported vehicles, the country club memberships, all of it was an elaborate hallucination funded by predatory loans. The mezzanine lender had likely issued a final demand for payment, threatening to foreclose on his properties and expose his bankruptcy to the entire Virginia elite. My father was desperate. He needed an immediate infusion of liquid capital to hold off the wolves. My $128,000 was not seed money for my brother to build an empire. The logistics software startup was a convenient, fabricated excuse. My stolen life savings acted as a desperate, panicked shield to appease an aggressive debt collector. The betrayal compounded, twisting into something infinitely darker. Chase was not the brilliant golden child being groomed for success. He was a disposable pawn. Silvia did not give me time to drown in the shock. She operated on momentum. She picked up her cell phone from the coffee table and dialed a private number from memory. She bypassed pleasantries when the line connected, speaking to a senior partner at a prominent venture capital auditing firm she frequently hired for corporate acquisitions. She spoke in cold, legal parameters. She requested a backdoor, unofficial inquiry into my brother's logistics software company. She provided the corporate name and the registered Virginia business address, instructing her contact to look for shell company formations, unusual vendor payouts, and rapid cash depletion. Silvia ended the call and placed the phone back on the table. She looked at me, her posture rigid and commanding. She stated that if my father was moving stolen funds to pay off predatory lenders, he could not do it through his own heavily monitored wealth management accounts without triggering a federal review. He had to wash the money. He needed a clean, seemingly legitimate corporate entity to funnel the cash through. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with sickening precision. My father had established the logistics startup entirely in my brother's name. Chase was the registered owner. Chase was the listed CEO. If the federal authorities ever launched a wire fraud investigation into the laundered funds, the paper trail would point directly to the sun. My father was fully prepared to sacrifice his own child to a federal prison sentence just to save his Loudoun County estate. Silvia poured another measure of bourbon into my glass. She told me we were no longer fighting a civil dispute over a stolen house fund. We had just stumbled into a massive federal cover-up. To dismantle my father's rotting empire, we needed undeniable proof of the fraudulent transfers. We needed to find the exact routing numbers linking my empty bank account to the mezzanine lenders. I looked down at my hands. They had stopped trembling. The crushing despair of the last 3 days vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened clarity. The hunt for the truth had officially begun, and I was ready to tear the foundation down to the dirt. The waiting in Sylvia Sterling's glass living room stretched into a tense, heavy silence. The ice in my crystal tumbler had melted, diluting the remaining bourbon, but I held on to the glass to ground myself. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the distant lights of the Virginia suburbs flickered against the dark horizon. My body temperature had finally stabilized. The shivering stopped. The frantic, uncoordinated panic of the last 3 days was being replaced by a cold, methodical focus. I was sitting across from a predator, and she was teaching me how to hunt. 30 minutes after Sylvia initiated her inquiry, her cell phone vibrated on the chrome coffee table. The screen illuminated, displaying a secure, encrypted caller identification. She did not pick the device up. She leaned forward, tapped the speaker icon, and rested her forearms on her knees. A voice filled the echoing room. It belonged to Gregory, a senior forensic auditor at a top-tier venture capital firm. He spoke with the clinical, detached rhythm of a man who diagnosed corporate fatalities for a living. He did not ask how Sylvia was doing. He immediately launched into the autopsy of my brother's logistics software company. Gregory reported that the startup was not merely underperforming, it was a structural illusion. On paper, the venture boasted a premium commercial lease in the Dulles Tech corridor, a sleek website, and a high monthly burn rate. But when Gregory dug into the actual operational expenditures, the facade crumbled. There were no software developers on the payroll. There were no server hosting contracts capable of supporting a logistics network. There was zero proprietary code being written. Instead, the vast majority of the capital bleeding out of the company accounts was being routed to a series of obscure third-party consulting firms and independent vendor payouts. I sat forward, my pulse quickening. I asked Gregory who owned those third-party consulting firms. The auditor paused for a fraction of a second, likely unaccustomed to an unknown voice on the line. But Sylvia gave a curt nod toward the phone, silently authorizing him to answer. Gregory stated the facts. He had pulled the rapid corporate filings from the state registry. The shell companies receiving the funds were all recently incorporated limited liability entities. The sole guarantor, the listed managing director, and the only authorized signatory for every single one of those shell entities was Chase Mitchell. The breath caught in my throat. I looked at Sylvia. Her gray eyes held a grim, unwavering knowing. Gregory continued his report, outlining the deeper financial mechanics. The venture capital world was small, and whispers of toxic debt moved quickly. He confirmed Sylvia's earlier suspicion. My father, Richard Mitchell, had indeed pledged several of his prime commercial real estate holdings as collateral for high-interest mezzanine loans. Those loans were currently in default. The aggressive private lenders were preparing to execute a hostile takeover of his properties. My father needed to pay those lenders immediately, but he could not simply wire money from his heavily regulated wealth management firm without alerting the authorities. He needed a laundry machine. The entire truth laid itself bare on the polished concrete floor of Sylvia's home. My father drained my $128,000, funneling it into the logistics startup under the guise of seed funding. From there, the money was washed through the fake vendor accounts established by Chase, eventually landing in the hands of the predatory mezzanine lenders to save my father's commercial real estate empire. But the most horrifying revelation was the legal structure of the fraud. My father was a veteran wealth manager. He knew exactly how to insulate himself from federal scrutiny. Richard's name did not appear on a single corporate charter associated with the startup or the shell entities. He had orchestrated the entire laundering operation using his son's blind arrogance. Chase signed the incorporation papers. Chase authorized the wire transfers. Chase leased the office space. If the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the Federal Bureau of Investigation, ever launched an inquiry into the missing funds or the fraudulent vendor payouts, the paper trail would end abruptly at my brother's desk. The federal authorities would not see a 60-year-old wealth manager orchestrating a complex embezzlement scheme. They would see a 35-year-old failing tech executive committing felony wire fraud. My father had not just sacrificed my life savings to protect his Loudoun County estate. He had constructed a legal guillotine over his own son's neck, fully prepared to let Chase go to a federal penitentiary to save himself. The Golden Child narrative was a terminal lie. Chase believed he was a brilliant entrepreneur being supported by a loving father. In reality, he was a disposable meat shield. My parents viewed both of their children as communal assets waiting to be harvested. I was the financial reservoir, and Chase was the legal liability sponge. Sylvia thanked Gregory and ended the call. The room plunged back into silence. I leaned back in the white leather armchair. My mind spun, trying to reconcile the image of the man who bought me ice cream on summer afternoons with the sociopathic architect of this financial ruin. The anger burning in my chest shifted from a wild, chaotic flame into a concentrated, white-hot beam. Sylvia stood up, walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, and looked out over the darkened tree line. She turned back to face me, her posture rigid, projecting the authority of a battlefield commander. She laid out the reality of civil litigation. She told me that hiring a lawyer to sue my father directly for the stolen house funds was a fool's errand. Because the account was an old custodial setup requiring his co-signature, he possessed a legal right to initiate the withdrawal. Proving unjust enrichment in a standard civil court would require years of depositions. The legal fees would consume the principal before we ever saw the inside of a courtroom. Furthermore, my father had already washed the cash. The money was gone, absorbed by the predatory lenders. We would be spending a fortune to chase a ghost. Sylvia walked back to the coffee table and leaned across the glass, bringing her face close to mine. Her voice dropped an octave, vibrating with intense strategic focus. She told me we were not going to file a polite civil grievance. We were going to trigger a catastrophic forensic audit. We were going to hand the entire fraudulent architecture over to a team of elite corporate litigators, forcing my father and my brother into total public liquidation. We would weaponize the threat of federal prison to strip my father of his wealth management licenses, his properties, and his curated high society reputation. We would tear his empire down to the bedrock. A surge of exhilarating purpose flooded my veins. I nodded, ready to authorize the strike. But Sylvia raised a single manicured finger, halting my momentum. She outlined the critical obstacle. My father was a seasoned financial operative. The moment he received a formal legal summons, he would instantly realize the laundering scheme had been compromised. He would activate emergency protocols, wiring his remaining liquid assets into offshore trusts, destroying the physical ledgers, and burying the evidence before a judge could even review our petition. To execute the trap successfully, Sylvia's legal team needed to file an emergency ex parte injunction. They needed a judge to freeze every single bank account tied to the Mitchell family without providing my father any prior warning. Securing that kind of immediate, unannounced judicial intervention required hard, undeniable proof. Circumstantial evidence and backdoor venture capital whispers were insufficient. A judge needed a smoking gun. Sylvia told me we needed the exact routing numbers linking my emptied bank account to the shell companies and ultimately to the mezzanine lenders. We needed a documented paper trail proving the funds were commingled. Without those specific routing numbers, the legal strike would stall, and my father would slip through the cracks. I looked down at the empty crystal glass in my hands. My father was notoriously paranoid about cybersecurity. He did not keep his sensitive financial ledgers on cloud servers or networked hard drives. Finding his routing numbers meant penetrating a fortress. I thanked Sylvia for the bourbon and the strategy. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my silk dress. The exhaustion had vanished. I walked out of the modernist glass house and drove back toward Alexandria. The path to unearthing my father's crimes required me to find a physical clue, a tiny slip in his otherwise flawless armor. I arrived back at my cramped, box-filled apartment just before midnight, unaware that my brother was about to hand me the exact weapon I needed. I stood in the narrow galley kitchen of my apartment watching a small pot of tap water come to a boil. The digital clock on the stove read 2 a.m. The adrenaline that had fueled my strategy session at Sylvia Sterling's Glass Fortress had finally burned off, leaving behind a brittle, hollow exhaustion. I reached into the pantry and pulled out a half-empty bag of plain white rice. It was the only substantial food left on the shelves. I poured a handful of the grains into the boiling water and leaned against the peeling laminate counter. The contrast between the staggering financial crimes I had just uncovered and the grim reality of my physical environment was jarring. My father was moving hundreds of thousands of dollars through shell companies to protect a sprawling commercial real estate portfolio, while I was carefully rationing generic rice to delay the creeping pangs of starvation. The apartment was suffocatingly quiet. Stacks of scavenged banana boxes filled the living room, towering against the walls, packed tight with my architectural history books. The 14-day eviction notice sat near the sink like a ticking bomb. I stirred the pot with a wooden spoon, the metallic scrape echoing in the cramped space. A sudden, sharp knock at the front door shattered the silence. I froze. The spoon slipped from my grasp, clattering against the rim of the pot. Nobody visits a pre-leased, run-down apartment building at 2 a.m. unless they bring bad news. I turned off the stove burner, wiped my hands on my slacks, and walked softly toward the entryway. I pressed my eye to the scratched peephole. Standing in the dimly lit, mildew-scented hallway was my older brother. Chase looked entirely out of place. He wore a bespoke Italian wool suit, a crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, and expensive leather loafers. The ambient light from the flickering hallway fixture caught the expensive watch on his wrist. He was dressed for a celebratory late-night dinner in downtown Washington, not a visit to a crumbling residential complex on the edge of town. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, projecting a nervous energy that contradicted his usual arrogant swagger. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open just a few inches, leaving the chain engaged. I did not invite him inside. I stared at him, my expression hardened into a flat, unforgiving line. Chase opened his mouth to deploy his standard breezy greeting, but the words died in his throat. He looked past my shoulder, his gaze sweeping over the interior of my apartment. He took in the towering cardboard boxes, the bare walls, the worn sofa, and the faint, sad smell of boiling rice. The curated delusion he had been living inside for the past few days suddenly pierced. The brutal, undeniable consequence of his bridge loan was staring him right in the face. He swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. The arrogant tech founder persona faltered, replaced by the profound discomfort of a man forced to witness his own collateral damage. Chase was not a sociopath incapable of feeling guilt. He was simply a product of extreme, lifelong insulation. Our parents had spent decades padding every sharp corner he ever encountered. Seeing me physically starving, surrounded by packing tape and eviction notices, broke through that padding. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, white envelope. His fingers trembled slightly as he held it out toward the narrow gap in the doorway. He dropped his voice, stammering over the syllables. He told me his logistics startup had secured an unexpected early milestone. He claimed the venture was already generating positive cash flow, and he wanted to distribute an early dividend to his founding equity partners. He shoved the envelope closer to the doorframe. He stated there was $3,000 in cash inside. He urged me to take it to cover my immediate expenses, promising that much larger returns were imminent once the software scaled. Dramatic irony dripped from every word he spoke. I stood there looking at the man who honestly believed he was a rising Silicon Valley titan throwing his struggling sister a lifeline. He had zero idea that his logistics software was a phantom entity. He did not know he was the designated fall guy for a multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud scheme. He thought he was handing me legitimate profits, completely ignorant of the fact that he was delivering hush money drawn directly from our father's illicit laundering operation. My pride screamed at me to slam the heavy wooden door in his face. I wanted to reject the envelope, to tell him his company was a shell and his entire legacy was a disposable fiction. But my stomach cramped fiercely. $3,000 meant I could secure a short-term rental. It meant I could hire a moving truck instead of dragging my possessions to the curb. It meant I could buy groceries tomorrow morning. Pride is a luxury item, and my bank account balance remained at $16. I reached through the gap, my fingers closing around the thick paper envelope. I did not say thank you. I did not offer absolution. I simply took the money and pulled my arm back. Chase let out a shallow, shaky exhale, visibly relieved to have unburdened his conscience. He could not maintain eye contact any longer. He turned on his heel and walked briskly down the hallway, fleeing the scene of the crime, desperate to return to the comfortable hallucination of his success. I shut the door and slid the deadbolt into place. I carried the envelope to the small, scratched dining table and tore the flap open. Thick stacks of crisp $100 bills spilled out onto the wood. The tactile sensation of the cash felt heavy and loaded with guilt. I sat down in the wooden chair, staring at the physical evidence of my stolen future. I reached out to count the bills, intending to calculate my immediate budget. As my fingers brushed the currency, my archival training subconsciously engaged. My career as a historic preservationist required a meticulous eye for detail. I spent my days examining the watermarks on colonial land grants, the fading ink on 18th century blueprints, and the specific typography of ancient legal documents. I was trained to look past the surface and read the provenance of paper. I picked up one of the stacks. The $100 bills were bound tightly together by a faded blue paper currency strap. I brought the paper band closer to the overhead light. If Chase had withdrawn this cash from the massive Tier 1 commercial bank he proudly claimed housed his startup capital, the strap would bear a recognized national corporate logo. It did not. Printed across the faded blue paper in a dated serif font was a specific emblem, Chesapeake Farmers and Merchants Credit Union. My brow furrowed. I traced my thumb over the ink. It was a highly obscure rural credit union located in a small farming county in Maryland, nearly 2 hours away from the Dulles Tech corridor. There was zero logical reason for a cutting-edge Virginia software startup to distribute dividends using cash bundled by a tiny agricultural lending institution. A sharp electric shock traveled down my spine. The memory clicked into place. Decades ago, before my father established his polished wealth management firm, he had attempted to launch a speculative real estate venture across the state line in Maryland. The venture had failed, but I remembered seeing that exact blue logo on the statements he used to leave scattered across his oak-paneled study. The connection was undeniable. Chase did not withdraw this cash from his startup account. My father handed this money directly to Chase, instructing him to go pacify his hysterical sister. The funds were being co-mingled. The $128,000 my father stole from my custodial account did not stay in Virginia. He was routing the stolen funds out of state, washing the capital through rural laundering stations where the oversight was minimal, before funneling it into the fake vendor accounts to pay his aggressive mezzanine lenders. This faded blue paper strap was the smoking gun. It was the exact routing clue Sylvia Sterling's corporate litigators needed to file their subpoenas and trace the laundering scheme. But a currency band alone would not convince a federal judge to grant an emergency ex parte injunction to freeze my father's assets. Anyone could acquire a bank strap. To launch the legal strike, the attorneys needed documented proof that my father controlled the accounts at that specific Maryland credit union. I set the bundled cash down on the table. The path forward was terrifying, but the required action was crystal clear. My father kept his true financial records off digital networks. The physical ledger detailing his illicit accounts, including the rural credit union routing numbers, resided in his locked filing cabinet in Loudoun County. I needed to break into my childhood home, infiltrate that oak-paneled study, and photograph a decade of federal crimes. The next morning, the shrill ring of my cell phone broke the heavy silence of my apartment. I stared at the screen. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. Helen had not contacted me directly since the confrontation on the veranda, preferring to wage her psychological war through the country club gossip network. I took a steadying breath and accepted the call. Helen did not offer a greeting. Her voice was crisp, practical, and laced with a casual cruelty that took my breath away. She demanded I drive out to the Loudoun County estate that afternoon to collect my childhood boxes from the spare bedroom. She instructed me to bring trash bags and clear the space out by sundown. When I asked why the sudden urgency, she delivered the insult without a hint of hesitation. She stated that Chase required a quiet, dedicated home office to manage his expanding logistics software startup. My parents were transforming my former sanctuary into a satellite command center for the Golden Child, using the very venture he funded with my stolen life savings as the justification to erase my physical history from their home. The sheer audacity of the summons stung, but an electric jolt of realization quickly overpowered the insult. This was not just an eviction from my childhood bedroom. This was a Trojan horse. My father operated with a high level of operational paranoia. He knew that digital ledgers left forensic footprints on cloud servers, susceptible to data breaches and remote subpoenas. For his true financial maneuvering, the illicit transfers, and the shadow accounts, he relied on physical paper. I knew those records resided in his primary study, locked away in a reinforced cabinet. Gaining access to that room without triggering the estate security system or raising suspicion was the primary obstacle holding up Sylvia Sterling's legal strike. Helen had just handed me the key to the fortress. I agreed to her terms, keeping my voice meek and compliant, playing the role of the defeated daughter. I arrived at the estate on a sweltering Saturday afternoon. The Virginia heat radiated off the crushed white stone of the circular driveway. The sprawling colonial house stood silent and imposing. I walked through the heavy front doors carrying a stack of flattened banana boxes I had scavenged earlier in the week. The interior of the house was chaotic, filled with the echoing voices of a design consultation. Helen and Richard were standing in the grand living room, flanking an expensive interior decorator who held a ring of fabric swatches. My father was gesturing toward the far wall, discussing custom mahogany millwork and leather wainscoting intended to give Chase's new office an executive energy. My mother was debating the merits of imported silk drapery. They barely acknowledged my arrival. Helen waved a dismissive hand toward the grand staircase, instructing me to keep my boxes away from the freshly polished hardwood floors. I kept my head down and climbed the sweeping stairs, my pulse beginning a frantic, escalating rhythm against my throat. Once I reached the second-floor landing, I did not turn left toward my old bedroom. I turned right. I moved silently down the carpeted hallway, stopping in front of the heavy, solid oak doors of my father's private study. I pressed my ear against the wood. The muffled sounds of the decorator discussing paint swatches drifted up from the living room. The auditory cover was perfect. I turned the brass knob and slipped inside, pulling the door shut until the latch clicked softly into place. The study smelled of aged leather lemon furniture polish and stale cigar smoke. Heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight across the tall windows, casting the room in a dim amber twilight. I stood in the center of the space, forcing my breathing to slow. I had roughly 20 minutes before anyone questioned my whereabouts. I approached the massive executive desk dominating the room. Behind it sat a tall, imposing filing cabinet. It was designed to mimic antique woodwork, but I knew it was a reinforced, fireproof steel vault. I examined the front panels. There was no traditional keyhole. There was no digital keypad. The drawers were secured by an internal, concealed magnetic locking mechanism. Panic threatened to cloud my focus, but I pushed it down, calling upon my 8 years of professional training. As a municipal archivist and historic preservationist, my daily life revolved around reverse engineering the physical habits of the past. I spent my career locating hidden compartments in 18th century secretary desks, finding concealed latches on colonial cabinetry, and reading the structural anomalies of old wood. People are creatures of habit. They leave tactile signatures on the environments they interact with every single day. I dropped to my knees and examined the edges of the heavy mahogany desk. I was not looking for a key. I was looking for a wear pattern. I traced my fingertips along the underside of the desk rim, feeling the rough, unfinished grain of the wood. I moved my hands slowly, searching for a disruption in the accumulated dust. Near the back right corner, tucked behind a thick decorative molding, my fingers brushed against a small, smooth square of cold metal. It was a heavy magnetic fob attached to the underside of the desk with industrial adhesive tape. I pulled the fob free, my hands trembling slightly, and stood up. I walked over to the filing cabinet and pressed the magnetic square against the upper left corner of the top drawer. A soft mechanical click echoed in the quiet room. I pulled the brass handle. The heavy steel drawer glided open on silent tracks. Inside sat a row of thick, black, leather-bound ledgers. I pulled the most recent volume from the rack and carried it to the desk, turning on a small, shaded reading lamp. I opened the heavy cover and flipped past the first few dozen pages. The columns were filled with my father's neat, precise, unmistakable handwriting. The true anatomy of the Mitchell family ruin was mapped out in black ink. I traced my finger down the rows. The facade my father presented to the world was a masterpiece of deception, but this book held the agonizing reality. I found the entries detailing the toxic commercial mortgages. The principal balances were staggering millions of dollars in the red. I saw the names of the predatory mezzanine lenders alongside the exorbitant, crippling interest rates, threatening to swallow his entire portfolio. Then I turned the page and found the exact sequence Sylvia required. There it was, a line item dated just a few days prior, $128,000. My father had explicitly written down the source of the funds, noting the withdrawal from my custodial account. He did not list it as a venture capital seed investment. He documented the transfer as a bridge payment to a distressed debt holding group. I followed the ink across the grid. The ledger proved that the stolen money did not go straight to the lenders. It was routed out of Virginia. My father documented the wire transfer into the Chesapeake Farmers and Merchants Credit Union in Maryland. From that obscure rural bank, the funds were chopped into smaller, less conspicuous amounts and funneled into 3 separate limited liability shell companies. Beside each shell company name, my father had written the authorized signatory required to release the funds: Chase Mitchell. The paper trail was flawless, undeniable, and entirely devastating. My father was orchestrating a massive embezzlement and laundering operation, using his own son's signature to insulate himself from federal wire fraud charges. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I checked to ensure the flash and the shutter sound were disabled. My hands were slick with cold sweat. I held the phone steady above the leather-bound book and began taking high-resolution photographs. I captured every single page. I photographed the routing numbers for the Maryland Credit Union. I captured the names of the fake vendor accounts. I took clear, focused shots of the forged invoices and the specific dates of the illicit transfers. I was holding a digital camera over a decade of federal crimes, documenting the exact evidence needed to trigger a total public liquidation of my abuser's empire. The silence in the study was profound, broken only by my shallow breathing. I flipped to the final section of the ledger, capturing the last few entries linking my stolen savings to the mezzanine debt payout. I had everything. The trap was fully loaded. I closed the heavy leather cover and prepared to slide the ledger back into the steel drawer. Then the auditory cover from downstairs abruptly changed. The muffled voices of the interior decorator and my mother faded toward the back of the house. The grand foyer went silent. A second later, the sharp, heavy creak of the oak staircase echoed through the floorboards. Someone was walking up the stairs. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and moving with purpose. They bypassed the landing leading to my old bedroom and turned right. They were heading directly toward the study. The heavy oak staircase groaned under the weight of ascending footsteps. The sound echoed through the second-floor corridor, steady and purposeful, heading straight toward the study. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm threatening to burst through my chest. The adrenaline surged, sharpening my senses to a razor edge. I had seconds. I shoved the heavy leather-bound ledger back into the fireproof steel drawer. I pushed the metal panel shut, ensuring the internal latch engaged with a soft mechanical click. I grabbed the magnetic fob from the top of the cabinet, dropped to my knees, and pressed the small metal square back into the industrial adhesive hidden under the rim of the mahogany desk. The footsteps reached the top landing and turned right. I stood up, my pulse roaring in my ears. The study had a secondary door, a narrow passage leading into a connecting guest bathroom that my father rarely used. I glided across the Persian rug, turned the brass knob, and slipped into the adjacent room just as the primary hallway door swung open. I pulled the bathroom door shut, leaving a fraction of an inch open so the latch would not make a sound. I pressed my back tightly against the cold, hexagonal porcelain tiles of the shower wall. The guest bathroom smelled of lavender soap and disuse. I held my breath, clenching my jaw so tight my teeth ached. I shoved my right hand into my pocket, gripping my cell phone, terrified the screen might illuminate with a random notification and betray my position in the dim light. Through the narrow crack in the door, I saw my father walk into the study. Richard Mitchell moved with a tense, hurried energy. He did not look toward the filing cabinet or the desk rim. He walked directly to a secondary credenza, muttered a low curse under his breath, and grabbed a manila folder filled with architectural blueprints for the new home office. He flipped through the pages, slammed the folder shut, and turned on his heel. He walked out of the room, leaving the heavy oak door open behind him. His footsteps retreated down the hallway, descending the grand staircase, back to the interior decorator waiting in the living room. I exhaled a shaky, silent breath. The rigid tension in my muscles dissolved, leaving my legs feeling like lead. I waited another 60 seconds, counting my own heartbeats, ensuring the second floor was truly deserted. I pushed away from the porcelain tiles and crept out of the bathroom. I bypassed the study entirely, moving swiftly down the carpeted hallway toward my childhood bedroom. I grabbed the flattened banana boxes I had brought with me, quickly tossed a few old debate trophies, a discarded quilt, and some dusty high school yearbooks inside to create a convincing prop. I did not risk the main staircase. I carried the heavy boxes down the narrow back utility stairs, a relic of the original colonial floor plan, which led directly into the mudroom near the garage. I pushed through the side exit, stepping out into the sweltering Virginia afternoon. The heat wrapped around me, but I welcomed the suffocating humidity. It meant I was outside the fortress. I walked across the crushed white stone, loaded the boxes into the trunk of my sedan, and climbed into the driver's seat. I locked the doors and started the engine, cranking the air conditioning to its maximum setting. Before putting the car in gear, I pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands were no longer shaking. I opened the encrypted photo gallery. The digital images glowed on the screen, crisp and undeniable. The neat rows of my father's handwriting, the Chesapeake Farmers and Merchants Credit Union routing numbers, the Shell Company formations, and Chase's authorized signatures were all perfectly captured. The crushing, humiliating shame of being a victim evaporated in the stifling cabin of my car. It was replaced by the cold, heavy weight of absolute leverage. I was holding the key to a federal indictment. I merged onto Route 7, bypassing my cramped apartment entirely. I drove straight into downtown Washington, navigating the weekend traffic towards Sylvia Sterling's corporate headquarters. Sylvia's firm occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek, modernist high-rise overlooking the Potomac. I bypassed the empty reception desk using the temporary security badge Sylvia had issued me and walked directly into the primary executive boardroom. The room was a testament to corporate warfare. A long, polished concrete conference table dominated the space, flanked by ergonomic mesh chairs and a wall of frosted glass. Sylvia was already there, standing alongside 2 men wearing sharp, unyielding expressions and tailored suits. She introduced them as Harrison Cole and David Vance, elite corporate litigators specializing in hostile asset recovery and financial fraud. They were sharks who swam in the deep waters of distressed debt and venture capital litigation. I did not offer small talk. I placed my phone on the table, connected it to the boardroom projection system, and mirrored the screen onto the frosted glass wall. The ledger photographs illuminated the dark room. Harrison Cole stepped closer to the glass, adjusting his glasses. He read the handwritten entries tracking the flow of the $128,000 from my custodial account straight through the rural Maryland laundering station and into the shadow entities registered to my brother. David Vance pulled up a state registry database on his laptop, cross-referencing the LLC names I had photographed. The verification took less than 10 minutes. The litigators confirmed the structure was a textbook embezzlement scheme designed to defraud the aggressive mezzanine lenders while utilizing a family member as a legal shield. Harrison turned to face the table, removing his glasses. He outlined the immediate legal strategy. The evidence was irrefutable. They possessed the exact documentation required to approach a federal judge and secure an emergency ex parte injunction. The judicial order would instantly freeze every single bank account, property deed, and commercial holding tied to Richard and Chase Mitchell. The financial blockade would be airtight before my father even realized he was under attack. Harrison folded his hands, adopting a cautious procedural tone. He suggested drafting the petitions over the weekend and serving the injunctions quietly on Tuesday morning. He proposed sending a discrete process server to my father's Loudoun County Wealth Management office before operating hours, minimizing public fallout and keeping the negotiations confined to closed-door arbitration. He argued that a quiet execution would prevent my father from creating a media spectacle or leveraging his high society connections to spin a defensive narrative. Sylvia stood at the head of the concrete table. She looked at Harrison, then turned her sharp gray eyes toward me. She smiled. It was a grim, predatory expression that chilled the ambient air of the boardroom. She rejected the attorney's cautious advice without a second thought. Sylvia stated that serving Richard quietly in his private office allowed him to retain his dignity. It allowed my mother to continue controlling the country club gossip network, and it allowed my brother to keep playing the role of a visionary Silicon Valley founder. A closed-door arbitration would not dismantle the rotting foundation. It would merely sweep the debris under a rug. Sylvia picked up a tablet from the table and pulled up a digital invitation she had intercepted through her venture capital contacts. She projected the invitation onto the frosted glass right beside the incriminating ledger photos. The digital flyer announced a massive seed funding gala hosted by Chase Mitchell. The event was scheduled for the upcoming Friday evening at a premier industrial chic warehouse on the Alexandria waterfront. Chase had invited the most prominent tech investors, real estate developers, and political figures in Virginia to showcase his logistics software and secure his next round of funding. My parents were listed as the guests of honor. Sylvia placed her hands flat on the concrete table. She instructed her lead litigators to finalize the emergency injunctions by Thursday afternoon. She told them they were not going to serve the papers in a quiet, carpeted office on a Tuesday morning. They were going to send the process server to the Alexandria waterfront on Friday night. They were going to execute the legal trap in the middle of the gala, under the glittering chandeliers, surrounded by the exact affluent society my parents had spent 30 years trying to impress. We were going to pull the pin on the grenade in front of every single investor Chase was attempting to defraud. The countdown had officially started. The transition from private theft to public ruin was set in motion, and there was no turning back. The transition from the sweltering heat of the Virginia afternoon into the cool maritime breeze of Friday evening offered no relief from the suffocating tension. The 6 days leading up to the Venture Capital Gala had been an exercise in agonizing endurance. While Sylvia Sterling's legal team worked around the clock in secured boardrooms, drafting the emergency ex parte injunctions and presenting the ledger evidence to a federal judge in a closed-door session, I was forced to maintain the illusion of my own defeat. I packed the remaining scavenged banana boxes in my cramped apartment, ignored the 14-day eviction notice sitting on the counter, and allowed my mother's country club gossip regarding my mental breakdown to circulate unchallenged. The silence was tactical, but it was excruciating. Friday night arrived, bringing the countdown to 0. The venue my brother selected for his seed funding gala was a breathtaking renovated industrial chic warehouse situated directly on the Alexandria waterfront. The building boasted soaring 50-foot ceilings, exposed brick walls, and massive steel-framed windows looking out over the dark, rolling water of the Potomac River. It was the exact type of expensive, historically significant architecture I spent my career trying to preserve, now being utilized as a grand stage for a massive financial illusion. I did not wear the emerald silk dress from the retirement dinner. I wore a tailored black suit I had purchased for a municipal board presentation years ago. It felt like appropriate attire for an execution. Sylvia arrived to pick me up in a sleek black town car. She wore a sharp, unyielding white pantsuit that looked less like formal wear and more like a suit of armor designed for corporate warfare. She did not offer words of encouragement during the short drive. The time for strategy had passed. We were now operating purely on momentum. We bypassed the valet stand and entered the warehouse through a set of heavy, reclaimed timber doors. The contrast between the cold, tactical reality I carried in my pocket and the warm, vibrant atmosphere of the gala was jarring. The cavernous room hummed with the sophisticated energy of Virginia's elite. A 5-piece brass band played upbeat jazz in the corner, filling the space with the bright, sharp blare of a trumpet and the steady rhythm of a stand-up bass. Waiters in crisp black aprons circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with seared scallops and crystal flutes of expensive champagne. The guest list was a curated roster of local power brokers. I recognized prominent real estate developers, senior partners from D.C. lobbying firms, and several angel investors who controlled the flow of capital in the Dulles Tech Corridor. Chase had spared no expense projecting an aura of boundless success designed to blind potential investors to the rotting structural reality of his startup. I stood in the shadows near the back of the room, positioned behind a towering indoor fern and a structural steel column. Sylvia stood beside me, her posture rigid, her gray eyes scanning the crowd with the calculating gaze of a sniper assessing the wind. Through the gaps in the foliage, I located my family. Richard and Helen Mitchell were holding court near the primary marble bar. They looked radiant. My mother wore a designer evening gown, her hair perfectly styled, laughing brightly as she accepted compliments from a circle of wealthy acquaintances. My father stood tall, holding a tumbler of bourbon neat, his chest puffed out with arrogant, undeniable pride. He clapped a local politician on the shoulder, projecting the image of a seasoned patriarch overseeing the triumphant expansion of his family empire. The dramatic irony saturating the room was thick enough to choke on. Every guest in the warehouse was drinking champagne funded by my stolen life savings. The exposed brick, the live jazz, the tailored suits, the polished facade of the Golden Child, everything was underwritten by fraudulent rural credit union transfers and the desperate need to appease aggressive mezzanine lenders. The attendees smiled and clapped, entirely unaware they were standing inside a financial black hole. But I knew the truth. Sylvia knew the truth. And the federal judge who had signed the asset freezing injunctions at 3 o'clock that afternoon knew the truth. At exactly 8 o'clock, the jazz band abruptly stopped playing. The lively chatter of the crowd faded into an attentive, expectant silence. Chase walked up to a small, raised wooden stage at the front of the room, standing beneath a massive digital projection of his logistics software logo. He looked immaculate. He tapped the microphone twice, adjusting his stance to project confident, effortless leadership. He smiled warmly at the audience, thanking the investors and the local politicians for their attendance. He began his pitch. He did not sound like a man balancing on the edge of a federal wire fraud indictment. He sounded like a visionary. He spoke about revolutionizing supply chain analytics, disrupting the market, and providing unprecedented value to his equity partners. He threw around industry buzzwords with practiced ease, painting a picture of guaranteed returns and exponential growth. Then he shifted his focus away from the software and directed his attention toward the marble bar. He pointed directly at our parents. Chase launched into a sickeningly hypocritical speech about the core values driving his success. He gripped the microphone stand, his voice swelling with manufactured emotion. He spoke about the importance of family, declaring that his parents had taught him the value of hard work, integrity, and self-reliance. He puffed his chest out, looking directly into the crowd of wealthy investors, and proudly proclaimed that he had built this logistics empire from the ground up, entirely on his own merit, without taking a single handout or asking for a shortcut. The staggering audacity of the statement echoed through the silent warehouse. He was demanding applause for his self-reliance while standing on a stage paid for by his sister's impending eviction and his father's federal crimes. The crowd broke into enthusiastic applause. Richard raised his glass of bourbon high into the air, toasting his son's brilliance, basking in the validation of the high society peers he had sacrificed everything to impress. Helen beamed, placing a manicured hand over her heart. Simultaneously, a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a nondescript gray suit cut through the cheering crowd. It was Sylvia's private process server. He did not look like a party guest, and he did not move like a waiter. He walked with a deliberate, unyielding momentum, navigating the dense throng of investors with ruthless efficiency. The tension in the back of the room spiked, tightening the muscles in my neck. Sylvia crossed her arms over her chest, watching the server advance. The process server reached the front row just as the applause began to die down. He did not wait for Chase to begin the next segment of his speech. He did not ask for permission. He climbed the 3 wooden steps onto the stage, walking directly into the glare of the presentation spotlights. He stopped, shoulder to shoulder, with my brother. The process server pulled a thick, heavy stack of manila folders from inside his suit jacket. He did not whisper. He did not attempt to be discreet. He leaned toward the microphone, his voice projecting clearly over the sophisticated sound system, reaching every single corner of the cavernous warehouse. He stated his full name, identified his legal credentials, and announced that he was executing an emergency ex parte judicial order. The words hung in the air, sharp and foreign, instantly shattering the curated illusion of the gala. The atmosphere in the warehouse shifted from celebratory to deeply uncomfortably tense. The investors in the front row stiffened, their smiles vanishing, as they recognized the gravity of a public legal interruption. The process server turned to face Chase, extending the thick stack of legal documents. The trap we had painstakingly constructed in the shadows was about to slam shut under the brightest lights in Virginia. The process server stood center stage, illuminated by the harsh glare of the presentation spotlights. The jazz band remained frozen in the corner. The hum of conversation among the Virginia elite had completely evaporated, replaced by a dense, electrified silence. He did not lower his voice to offer a polite, discreet delivery. He leaned directly into the microphone stand that Chase had just abandoned. He projected his words with the booming, unyielding authority of a court bailiff. He formally identified Richard and Chase Mitchell by their full legal names. He announced to the cavernous warehouse that he was executing an emergency ex parte judicial order signed by a federal judge just hours prior. He thrust the thick stack of manila folders directly into Chase's chest. Chase reflexively brought his hands up, grabbing the documents before they could scatter across the wooden stage. In his panic, he dropped the microphone. It hit the floorboards with a heavy thud, sending a sharp, ear-piercing squeal of feedback echoing through the silent room. Several guests winced, covering their ears. The server did not flinch at the noise. He turned his body slightly, ensuring his voice carried to the back rows of the audience without the aid of the sound system. He announced the specific charges listed on the federal injunction. He stated the words slowly, enunciating each syllable with devastating clarity. Gross fiduciary fraud. Corporate embezzlement, the laundering of illicit funds through unregistered shell entities. Finally, he delivered the kill shot. He announced the immediate total freezing of all commercial assets, real estate holdings, and bank accounts associated with the Mitchell family name, pending a full forensic audit by federal authorities. He stepped off the stage, his duty fulfilled, and walked briskly back through the stunned crowd, disappearing into the humid night air. Chase stood frozen on the stage. The arrogant, visionary posture he had maintained just 90 seconds prior collapsed entirely. He stared down at the bold black legal text printed across the front page of the injunction. He saw the list of shell companies he had incorporated. He saw the routing numbers from the Rural Maryland Credit Union. The realization that he was the designated fall guy for a multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud scheme slammed into him. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. His knees gave out. He collapsed onto the wooden stage, dropping the legal documents, burying his face in his trembling hands as a raw, panicked sob tore from his throat. Down on the floor near the primary marble bar, the social execution was swift and merciless. The angel investors, the prominent real estate developers, and the senior partners from D.C. lobbying firms did not wait for an explanation. In the world of venture capital, the mere whisper of toxic debt and frozen assets is radioactive. The mention of federal wire fraud and embezzlement was a death sentence. The men and women in the front row, the exact high society peers my parents had sacrificed my future to impress, exchanged horrified, calculating glances. They immediately set their crystal champagne flutes down on the nearest tables and began backing away, moving in a coordinated, rapid retreat toward the heavy timber exit doors. Nobody wanted to be photographed near a sinking ship. Richard Mitchell stood rooted to the spot. His tumbler of bourbon slipped from his fingers, shattering against the concrete floor. The amber liquid pooled around his expensive dress shoes. The towering legend of the self-made Loudoun County wealth manager shattered right alongside the glass. The curated illusion of his aristocratic invincibility was gone, stripped away in front of his entire network, leaving behind nothing but a frightened, bankrupt thief. Helen was standing just a few feet away near the edge of the stage. She had a clear view of the bold, printed words on the scattered subpoena pages. The horrific reality of the moment overloaded her nervous system. The secret was out. The decade of lies, the toxic commercial mortgages, the stolen $128,000, the fake logistics software company, all of it was exposed. The country club gossip network she had weaponized against me earlier in the week was now witnessing her total, undeniable ruin. The sheer, overwhelming panic of public humiliation was too much for her to process. Helen let out a short, gasping breath. Her eyes rolled back in her head. She fainted, collapsing onto the polished concrete floor with a sickening thud. Chaos erupted. A waiter rushed forward, kneeling beside my mother. Several guests shouted for someone to call an ambulance. The jazz band hurriedly packed their instruments, eager to flee the unfolding disaster. Through the frantic movement of the collapsing gala, Richard snapped out of his paralyzed shock. His arrogant pride mutated into a blind, desperate rage. He shoved his way through the retreating investors, his face flushed a furious red, frantically searching the room for the architect of his destruction. He looked toward the back of the warehouse, past the towering indoor fern and the structural steel column. Our eyes locked. I stood in the shadows, flanked by Sylvia Sterling in her armor-like white suit. I did not shrink back. I did not flinch under the weight of his furious glare. I expected to feel a soaring, triumphant vindication. I expected the crushing weight of the eviction notices and the stolen house funds to lift off my shoulders, replaced by the warm glow of vengeance. I thought detonating the grenade would bring me peace. Instead, staring at the ruins of my family, I felt a profound, clarifying emptiness. The man staring back at me was not a monster. He was not a sophisticated criminal mastermind. He was just a pathetic, desperate fraud who chose to destroy his own daughter to protect a failing commercial real estate portfolio. I had just initiated the legal execution of my own family, and the justice I demanded was absolute, but it offered no emotional warmth. I did not offer a cinematic monologue. I did not smile, and I certainly did not gloat. I held my father's furious gaze for 3 long seconds, offering him a look of cold, chilling indifference. I recognized the terminal rot of his foundation, and I refused to spend another second standing inside the blast radius. I turned my back on Richard Mitchell. I walked toward the heavy timber doors, pushing them open, and stepped out into the cool maritime breeze of the Alexandria waterfront. Sylvia followed closely behind me, her heels clicking a steady, victorious rhythm against the pavement. The chaotic screams and the shattering glass of the ruined gala faded as the heavy doors swung shut. The public execution was complete, but the legal war was far from over. The spectacle at the warehouse had successfully frozen my father's assets, preventing him from hiding the stolen funds offshore. But freezing the capital was only half the battle. To recover my life savings and permanently strip Richard of his power, we had to drag him into a sterile, windowless room, sit him in front of a court reporter, and force him to confess the entire ugly truth on the official legal record. The deposition was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and it promised to be a grueling exercise in dismantling the final delusions of the Mitchell family empire. 3 weeks later, the battlefield shifted from a glamorous waterfront warehouse to a sterile, windowless conference room in downtown Richmond. The transition from the chaotic, vibrant energy of the Alexandria Gala to this unforgiving legal environment was jarring. There were no jazz bands playing here. There were no crystal champagne flutes or high society peers to impress. The room was illuminated by harsh overhead fluorescent lights that cast deep, unflattering shadows across the faces of everyone sitting at the long, polished mahogany table. The only sound was the quiet, rhythmic clack of the court reporter pressing the keys on her stenography machine, capturing every spoken syllable for the official legal record. I sat next to Sylvia Sterling, keeping my hands folded tightly in my lap. Across the table sat my father. Richard Mitchell looked like a hollow ghost of the arrogant patriarch who had raised his glass in triumph just 21 days ago. His bespoke suit hung loosely on his frame, the fabric wrinkling around his shoulders. His skin was pale, and a thin layer of sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chilling air conditioning. He sat beside his own defense attorney, a frantic-looking man who had spent the last 3 weeks filing useless procedural motions in a desperate attempt to delay this exact moment. A formal deposition is a brutal, methodical process. It strips away all the comforting myths and defensive posturing a person uses to survive their own guilt. There is no room for grand emotional speeches. There is no space for shifting blame. There are only direct questions demanding direct answers under the strict penalty of perjury. Harrison Cole. Sylvia's lead corporate litigator began the interrogation with surgical precision. He did not raise his voice. He did not pound his fist on the table. He simply opened a thick black binder and began laying out the undeniable paper trail. Harrison reached into the binder and pulled out the high-resolution photographs I had taken inside the oak-paneled study. He slid the images across the smooth wood, stopping them just inches from my father's hands. The pictures displayed the handwritten ledger entries, the obscure rural credit union routing numbers, and the forged vendor invoices. Harrison looked at my father and asked him to identify the handwriting. My father's defense attorney objected immediately, citing improper discovery protocols, but Harrison swatted the objection aside with practiced ease. The photographs were admissible, and the court reporter waited her hands, hovering over the keys. Richard stared down at the glossy paper. He swallowed hard. His vocal cords seemed to seize, but the threat of a perjury charge forced his compliance. He leaned toward the microphone and offered a single, ragged syllable. Yes. With that one word, Harrison tightened the noose. The attorney walked my father through the timeline step by step, forcing him to narrate his own destruction. Harrison asked about the toxic commercial mortgages. He demanded Richard state the total debt owed to the predatory mezzanine lenders. He asked my father to verify the exact date he walked into the Alexandria Bank branch and drained the custodial trust account containing my $128,000. Every answer chipped away at the towering legend of the self-made Virginia wealth manager, leaving behind nothing but a frightened, desperate thief cornered by his own ledgers. Then Harrison turned the page in his binder. The line of questioning shifted away from the initial theft and focused directly on my brother's logistics software startup. Harrison asked my father who established the limited liability shell companies receiving the laundered funds. Richard admitted he directed the formations. Harrison asked whose name was listed on the incorporation charters as the sole guarantor. Richard closed his eyes, his jaw trembling, and whispered my brother's name, Chase. The litigator pressed further, ensuring the darkest truth entered the permanent record. He asked if Chase possessed any knowledge regarding the fraudulent nature of the business. He asked if Chase knew the vendor payouts were actually servicing toxic real estate debt. Richard shook his head, keeping his eyes glued to the table. He admitted his son knew nothing. The confession hung in the freezing air of the conference room. My father had knowingly constructed a legal guillotine over his own child. If the federal authorities had discovered the laundering operation before Sylvia intervened, Chase would have been indicted for wire fraud. My father was fully prepared to let his son serve a decade in a federal penitentiary just to avoid losing his Loudoun County estate. The golden child was nothing more than a disposable shield, a naive pawn sacrificed to protect the patriarch. Harrison Cole was not finished. He leveled a cold, unblinking gaze at my father and asked the final, fatal question. He demanded to know the specific logic behind the theft. He asked Richard why he chose to raid my savings instead of liquidating his own remaining retirement portfolios or selling his personal vehicles to satisfy the debt. Cornered, stripped of his usual defenses, and drowning in humiliation, my father resorted to the archaic, toxic worldview that governed his entire existence. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the mahogany table, and spoke his twisted truth into the microphone. He stated that I was an unmarried municipal employee. He said that a single woman working in historic preservation did not require large sums of liquid capital because she had no dependents to feed and no empire to build. He claimed that an 18th century row house was an unnecessary extravagance for someone of my status. He then contrasted my life with his son's future. He declared that Chase carried the Mitchell name. A son required a prominent foundation to restore the household honor. He looked right at me, his eyes narrowing with a bitter defensive judgment, and stated that liquidating my savings was the correct strategic decision for the survival of the family legacy. The casual, suffocating cruelty of his statement echoed off the windowless walls. I sat across from him, my pulse steady, feeling an unexpected sense of profound relief. For 32 years, a microscopic thread of childhood affection had kept me tethered to this man. I had spent my life seeking his approval, trusting his financial advice, and hoping he viewed me as an equal. Hearing his toxic entitlement spoken aloud on the official legal record served as the final blade severing that tether. I did not see a father sitting across from me. I saw a biological stranger. The emotional bond was permanently destroyed, leaving my conscience entirely clear for what came next. Harrison Cole nodded, processing the statement without a flicker of emotion. He closed the evidentiary binder and pulled a much thinner blue folder from his briefcase. He slid it across the table. It was the finalized settlement agreement. Harrison laid out the ultimatum. He explained that Sylvia's firm currently possessed the unredacted ledger photographs, the credit union transfer logs, and the sworn deposition transcript detailing a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. The litigator presented option A. If Richard refused to sign the settlement, Harrison would walk out of the conference room and hand the entire dossier directly to the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia. Federal prosecutors would immediately file criminal charges for bank fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. Richard would spend the rest of his natural life in a federal cell. Then Harrison presented option B, total unmitigated financial liquidation. To satisfy the outstanding debts and reimburse my stolen funds, my father had to surrender everything. The settlement dictated that Richard and Helen would immediately forfeit the deed to their sprawling Loudoun County estate. The property would be turned over to the bank for public auction. They would surrender their imported vehicles, liquidate their meager remaining retirement accounts, and relinquish all future claims to any portion of their commercial real estate portfolio. The proceeds would be seized to satisfy the mezzanine lenders, with the remainder routed directly back into my control to cover the $128,000 plus all accrued legal fees. My father would be left with 0 assets, 0 properties, and 0 reputation. He would be reduced to renting a cramped apartment, stripped of the wealth he valued above his own children. but he would keep his freedom. Richard stared at the blue folder. He looked at his defense attorney, his eyes wide with sheer, suffocating panic, hoping for a hidden loophole. The defense attorney offered a grim, slow nod. There was no way out. The leverage was absolute. My father reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the heavy metal pen provided by the court reporter. His fingers shook so violently he could barely grip the barrel. He lowered the pen to the signature line on the final page of the settlement. The ink bled into the crisp white paper, locking in his destruction. He signed his empire away, trading his curated Virginia legacy for the guarantee that he would not die in prison. Harrison Cole gathered the signed documents and announced he had no further questions. He requested a short 10-minute recess before reviewing the final asset transfer protocols with the opposing counsel. The court reporter stopped typing. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The revelations of the last 2 hours made the sterile air feel heavy and hard to breathe. I needed a moment alone to process the reality that the war was practically won. I walked out of the conference room and headed down the long, quiet hallway toward the restroom, unaware that my mother was waiting for me in the shadows. The hallway outside the conference room felt miles long. The polished linoleum floor reflected the harsh fluorescent lights, blurring my vision as I walked toward the restroom. My mind spun in chaotic, frantic circles, trying to process the sheer weight of the signed settlement sitting on the mahogany table. The realization that my father was officially bankrupt, his sprawling Loudoun County estate slated for immediate bank auction, shifted the entire foundation of my reality. The war was effectively over, but the emotional debris field was vast and terrifying. I pushed through the heavy wooden door of the restroom. The space was quiet, lined with pale granite tiles and a row of large mirrors hanging above the sinks. I walked over to the nearest basin, turned on the cold water, and splashed it across my face. The icy shock helped steady my racing heartbeat. I gripped the edges of the porcelain sink, taking deep, slow breaths, staring at my own pale reflection. I looked exhausted, holding the heavy burden of a victory that felt more like a funeral. The heavy wooden door creaked open behind me. I looked up into the mirror. My mother stood in the doorway. Helen Mitchell looked like a shadow of the vibrant woman who held court at the Alexandria Waterfront Gala just 3 weeks ago. Her hair, usually styled in an immaculate stiff bob, hung limp around her face. She wore a simple dark dress that seemed to swallow her small frame. The haughty, judgmental aura she carried on the veranda during our initial confrontation was completely gone. She did not look like a woman preparing to deliver a lecture on family loyalty or country club decorum. She looked terrified. I froze my hands gripping the sink. I expected her to yell. I braced myself for a barrage of insults, waiting for her to accuse me of humiliating her husband in front of the elite corporate litigators. Instead, Helen closed the door softly behind her. She took 2 steps toward me, and then her knees buckled. She did not faint. She simply collapsed under the crushing weight of the impending liquidation. She slid down the pale granite wall, sinking to the floor. She buried her face in her hands and began to weep. The sound was not the delicate, practiced crying of a Virginia socialite trying to elicit sympathy at a charity luncheon. It was a raw, ugly, guttural wail. It was the sound of a woman watching her entire curated life disintegrate into ash. I turned around slowly, my back pressing against the cold porcelain sink. I stared down at the woman who raised me. The anger that had fueled me for the last month flickered and dimmed, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming wave of pity. I took a hesitant step forward, closing the distance between us. I knelt down on the cold floor, pulling my knees to my chest, sitting just an arm's length away from her. I did not offer a comforting word. I simply waited. Helen raised her head. Her face was streaked with running mascara, her eyes bloodshot and swollen. She looked at me with a pathetic, desperate vulnerability I had never seen before. She reached out with a trembling hand grasping my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. She started to speak, her voice shaking so hard the words tangled together. She begged me to instruct Sylvia Sterling's attorneys to withdraw the settlement. She pleaded with me to pause the bank auction, to give my father time to restructure the mezzanine debt and save the Loudoun County estate. She confessed the depth of the nightmare they had been living, describing the suffocating terror of opening the mail every afternoon, terrified of finding another foreclosure notice. She looked right into my eyes and said, the prospect of public poverty terrified her more than death. I listened to her confession, the messy, complicated reality of our family trauma washing over me. I understood her terror. The sheer human desperation driving their theft made it impossibly difficult to hold on to my cold, clinical rage. But then my mother offered an explanation for why they chose to sacrifice me instead of Chase. She tightened her grip on my wrist, pulling me slightly closer. She lowered her voice to a hoarse whisper, attempting to offer what she genuinely believed was a profound compliment. She told me I was resilient. She said I was built from tougher material than my older brother. She reminded me of how I scraped my way through graduate school, working 3 jobs, surviving on meager grants to build my career in historic preservation. She said I knew how to navigate the hard edges of the world. Then she talked about Chase. She said my brother was fragile beneath his arrogant exterior. She confessed that Chase possessed a delicate, easily shattered ego, and if he realized the family was destitute and his logistics startup was a phantom laundry machine, the shame would destroy him. She told me Chase needed the illusion of success to survive, while I possessed the internal grit to survive the reality of failure. Helen looked at me with a twisted, desperate sincerity. She admitted she sacrificed my future because she knew I was strong enough to rebuild it, and she knew Chase would drown without a life vest. The toxic compliment hung in the quiet air of the restroom. I stared at my mother. The sheer, staggering dysfunction of her logic paralyzed me. She loved me, but she loved me for my ability to endure suffering. She viewed my resilience as a renewable resource, a communal asset she could harvest to protect her fragile golden child. She expected me to absorb the trauma, the poverty, and the impending eviction simply because I was capable of surviving it. A profound, clarifying sorrow washed over me. I realized in that exact moment that the Mitchell family dynamic was a terminal illness. There was no cure. There was no amount of money or therapy that would ever convince my parents to view my life as equally valuable to my brother's. They would always demand I set myself on fire to keep Chase warm. I gently pulled my wrist out of her grasp. I looked at the weeping, broken woman sitting on the floor. The messy, emotional conflict peaked right there in the pale granite tiles. I loved my mother. The bond of biology and shared history is a powerful, stubborn force. But I finally understood that loving her could not cost me my own survival. I could no longer be the designated casualty of her generational terror. I wiped a stray tear from my own cheek. I spoke in a quiet, steady voice, free from the screaming rage of the veranda confrontation. I told Helen I forgave her for being terrified of poverty. I told her I understood the panic the private lenders caused, but I also told her the liquidation settlement was moving forward. Helen gasped, her eyes widening in renewed terror. She reached for me again, begging me to save the house. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my tailored suit. I looked down at her, feeling a hollow, agonizing finality. I told her my resilience was no longer available for her to spend. I said I was done surviving the ruins of her bad decisions. I told her they were going to surrender every single asset they owned to repay my stolen funds, and they were going to face the fallout without my life savings acting as a shield. I turned my back on my mother. I walked toward the heavy wooden door, pulling it open. The bright, harsh light of the hallway spilled into the restroom. I did not look back. I walked out, leaving Helen sobbing alone on the floor, mourning the absolute end of the family she destroyed. I walked back down the long, polished hallway of the courthouse, my heels clicking a steady rhythm against the linoleum. The agonizing internal war was over. I had looked my mother in the eye, recognized her toxic love for what it was, and severed the emotional chains binding me to her survival. I pushed open the heavy glass door of the conference room and took my seat next to Sylvia Sterling, ready to finalize the destruction of my parents' curated delusion and reclaim my own unshakable foundation. The ink on the settlement agreement dried, and the execution of the terms moved with the cold mechanical efficiency of a wrecking ball. The temporary federal injunctions evolved into permanent financial blockades. Chase Mitchell's logistics startup ceased to exist, evaporating the moment the frozen assets were surrendered to the mezzanine lenders. My brother experienced a harsh, unglamorous collision with reality. Stripped of his commercial lease, his bespoke Italian wool suits, and the secret laundering operation that subsidized his arrogance, Chase was forced to join the actual working class. He no longer delivers polished venture capital pitches in sleek Dulles co-working spaces. He now works at a vast, windowless call center in Fairfax. He wears a faded polo shirt and a plastic headset, spending his days walking frustrated customers through the grueling process of resetting their internet routers. The golden child was reduced to earning his living through entry-level technical support, forced to interact with the world without a financial safety net to catch his mistakes. My parents faced an equally severe reckoning. The predatory lenders stripped my father's commercial portfolio to the bone. To satisfy the remaining debt and reimburse my stolen funds, Richard and Helen were evicted from their sprawling Loudoun County estate. They moved into a cramped two-bedroom apartment near a noisy interstate interchange. The curated illusion of Virginia aristocracy was erased. From the liquidated remains of my father's empire, Sylvia Sterling's attorneys extracted my stolen life savings. The exact figure of $128,000 materialized back into my checking account. But Sylvia did not just hand me my money and walk away. She recognized the strategic advantage we held in the aftermath of the collapse. She offered a new proposition, extending a substantial corporate credit line backed by her own real estate firm, urging me to strike while the iron was hot. The physical assets of Chase's Phantom Company went to a commercial liquidation auction. He had purchased top-tier infrastructure to maintain his Illusion high-capacity data servers, advanced spatial mapping software licenses, and pristine hardware. I attended the auction and used a fraction of my recovered funds to purchase the entire technological setup. I acquired the very tools my brother bought with my stolen future, securing them for pennies on the dollar. Then came the crown jewel of the Mitchell family ruin. The Loudoun County estate went to a bank foreclosure auction on the steps of the regional courthouse. The morning air was crisp and clear. I stood on the concrete plaza holding a cashier's check funded by Sylvia's credit line. When the auctioneer called out the address of the colonial mansion, I raised my bidding paddle. I purchased my childhood home at a staggering discount, seizing the deed to the exact property my father committed federal crimes to protect. A week later, I unlocked the heavy front doors and walked into the empty estate. The velvet drapery, the mahogany furniture, and the crystal glasses of iced tea were gone. It was just a hollow shell. Stripped of its pretension, I could finally see the structure for what it was. I did not keep it as a residential property. I petitioned the county zoning board and filed the legal paperwork to establish a new historical preservation nonprofit. The grand living room where my mother used to host exclusive country club luncheons and spin lies about my mental health was transformed into an open-plan archival workspace. We tore up the pristine carpets to reveal the hardwood beneath, installing drafting tables and digital scanning stations. I directed the moving crew to carry Chase's liquidated data servers up the grand staircase. We installed the humming, glowing hardware directly inside my father's former oak-paneled study. We placed the main terminal on the exact footprint where his locked filing cabinet used to sit. I did not let the logistics mapping software go to waste. I hired a team of data analysts and municipal archivists to repurpose the algorithms. Instead of tracking imaginary supply chains, my team used the advanced spatial tech to map endangered historical properties across the entire state of Virginia. We utilized the processing power to identify structural vulnerabilities in 18th century architecture, track the distribution of municipal restoration grants, and catalog colonial land deeds. I took the ultimate monument to toxic elitism and transformed it into a public resource dedicated to saving forgotten history. I took the exact weapon my family used to destroy my independence and reforged it into my own towering legacy. The Municipal Planning Board recognized the unprecedented scale and efficiency of the new preservation initiative. They awarded me the executive directorship of the organization. The community rumors that I was a bitter, unstable spinster vanished overnight, replaced by genuine professional respect and local admiration. With my career secured and my finances restored, I drove back to the Alexandria waterfront. I finally signed the closing papers on my dream home. I walked up the brick steps of the dilapidated 18th century row house, slid a heavy brass key into the antique lock, and pushed the door open. The floorboards creaked, and the air smelled of old wood and river breeze. The house required a tremendous amount of restoration, but I knew how to fix it. The foundation was solid. The bones were good. If you are standing in a storm right now, wondering if you have the strength to fight back against the people who are supposed to protect you, know this: you are worth saving, even if you have to save yourself. We often look at families through the lens of what they accumulate. In the landscape of modern American culture, success is frequently measured by tangible milestones. It is the sprawling estate behind wrought iron gates, the thriving tech startup, and a family name that commands respect at the country club. But beneath the polished wood floors and manicured lawns, a quiet spiritual crisis unfolds in millions of homes. Autumn's story is not merely a tale of financial betrayal and corporate retaliation. It is a profound modern parable. It is a mirror held up to the illusions of the ego and the steep spiritual cost of conditional love. When parents build their family's foundation on pride and deception simply to avoid looking like a failure to their neighbors, that foundation will inevitably rot from the inside out. True wealth is not a commercial real estate portfolio protected by shell companies. True wealth is an honest conscience. You do not create a strong, capable adult by paving the road for them with stolen money. You create a fragile, entitled ego that will shatter at the first sign of real-world adversity. Healing generational trauma requires radical truth. It requires looking at the people who hurt you, recognizing their toxic fear, and refusing to be the designated casualty of their delusions. Autumn did not just survive the rotting structure of her family. She tore it down to the studs. She repurposed the wreckage, cleared the debris, and built an unshakable legacy on the bedrock. If you find value in these reflections, and if navigating the messy, beautiful, and sometimes painful reality of human relationships resonates with your own journey, please take a moment to follow our channel, Calm Drama Stories. We explore the deep truths hidden in everyday lives, and we would love to have you walk this path of understanding with us. Drop a comment below, hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.